At an altitude of 10,000 meters, amidst the darkness and the roar of the engines, Isabelle Carter wasn't just sitting in a chair, she was sitting on the thin line between dignity and prejudice. When that man pointed at her and said, "People like you don't deserve to be here," the entire cabin fell silent, not out of agreement, but out of familiarity with the notion that the strong always win. She could have bowed her head, changed seats, and let an insult slide by like thousands of times before. But this time, she stood up not to defend a seat, but to protect the one thing no one could buy: self-respect. In the black night suspended in the sky, Isabelle forced the entire cabin to confront the very prejudices they carried with them. Outside the narrow window, the sky stretched endlessly, black as ink, with only the faint light from the airplane's wing tearing through the murky darkness. At over 10,000 meters, where the ground was nothing more than a hazy memory, Flight 427 glided silently across the Atlantic sky. In the business class cabin, soft golden light bathed the rows of luxurious leather seats, casting a glow on the weary yet composed faces of the passengers. A strange silence enveloped the space, not the silence of sleep, but a tense stillness, hinting at something waiting to erupt. Isabelle Carter sat quietly in seat 4A, her hands resting neatly on her lap, her gaze distant as she looked through the frost-covered window. She wore a simple, elegant suit with sharp tailoring not overly ornate, but enough to signal that she belonged to a world of people who stood on their own 2 feet. Printed clearly on her ticket was her name, Seat 4A, a legitimate business class ticket. But the one thing that ticket couldn't prove was whether Isabelle Carter deserved to be there. In the eyes of people like Thomas Bennett, the sound of hurried footsteps shattered the quiet atmosphere. A tall man with salt and pepper hair dressed in a pristine suit approached her row. He stopped, glanced at the ticket in his hand, then let his eyes slide over Isabelle, an unmasked look of scrutiny and contempt. "You're in the wrong seat," he said, his voice not informing but accusing. Isabelle turned to him, polite, gently presenting her ticket. "I believe my seat is 4A. Thomas Bennett gave the ticket a quick glance, then frowned, his eyes darting from the seat number to her face, to her skin, as if what he saw on the ticket couldn't possibly be correct. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice no longer hiding its irritation. "Because I know for sure that people like you don't sit here." The words "people like you" dropped into the cabin like a stone. A few passengers cast absent glances their way, their eyes indifferent, yet attentive enough to listen. The young flight attendant, Emma, hurried over, her youthful face tinged with unease. She bent slightly, her voice soft, trying to diffuse the tension. "I'm sorry, it seems there's been a mix-up in the system. Mrs. Carter, we might have assigned the wrong seat. If you don't mind, I can arrange another spot for you right away." Those words, seemingly harmless, felt to Isabelle like a blunt knife slowly cutting into her pride. She knew those looks, knew them all too well. Eyes that were used to seeing her and people like her in the back rows, at service counters, behind closed doors, never accustomed to seeing her sit as an equal, in places of value. She could easily have nodded, smiled, stood up, and switched seats, as she had done countless times before in her life. She could have chosen silence, kept herself safe, yielded, and let the flight pass as others wanted, neatly, pleasantly, without trouble. But tonight, at 10,000 meters, amid the low rumble of the engines and the pitch-black darkness outside, Isabelle Carter knew she wasn't just sitting in a seat. She was sitting on the fragile boundary between dignity and prejudice, between freedom and submission. And she knew that if she bowed her head again, she wouldn't just lose a seat, she'd be teaching this entire cabin that power and prejudice could buy silence. Isabelle lifted her head slightly, her voice low and sharp. "I'm afraid, tonight, I won't be leaving this seat." The space before her was no longer just the business class cabin. It was a silent battlefield where people would witness not a quarrel, but a wordless confrontation between a superior gaze and the dignity of a human being. The air in the business class cabin sagged, as if someone had turned down the oxygen. The steady hum of the engines persisted outside, but inside, all eyes turned to 3 people: Isabelle Carter, Thomas Bennett, and the young flight attendant Emma, as if they were the only ones still breathing in that cabin. Thomas raised an eyebrow, momentarily thrown off by Isabelle's brief but razor-sharp response. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by a black woman on what he considered his own territory. "Ma'am," he lowered his voice, but each word struck the air like a hammer. "I think you don't understand. This is business class. People like you don't usually sit here." Emma fidgeted, her eyes darting between the two, her hands clutching a small tablet as if clinging to something safe. She knew this was spiraling out of control, but her youthful inexperience and fear of upsetting a VIP like Thomas kept her rooted in place. Isabelle didn't reply immediately. She looked straight into Thomas's eyes, her gaze not angry, not bursting forth but cold, deep, and dangerous, like still water before a storm. "I understand perfectly well where I'm sitting," she said, her voice even and calm to an unsettling degree. "The question is, do you understand why you think I don't belong here?" That statement silenced the scattered whispers from the back of the cabin. A few passengers pretended to adjust their seat belts. Others looked up from their magazines, phones pausing mid-air. Everyone knew business class wasn't a place for arguments, but what was unfolding here was no longer about a seat dispute. Thomas let out a scornful laugh, the laugh of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. "I know you. Isabelle Carter, the poor girl from Brooklyn, daughter of a janitor. I've read about you in magazines. A nice fairy tale. But don't forget that suit you're wearing, that ticket you're holding. It's all just paint. Beneath that paint, you're still the one who had to bow down and clean up after dinners for people like me." His words landed, heavier than the oppressive cabin pressure. Some passengers frowned, others deliberately looked out the window, pretending not to hear. Emma bit her lip, shifting awkwardly, a fleeting apologetic glance brushing past Isabelle before quickly looking away. Isabelle took a deep breath. She'd heard words like these thousands of times, in thousands of forms, from street whispers, colleagues' glances to the quiet rejections at major conferences. But never had prejudice taken shape so clearly, so raw and brutal, right here in the dark of night, among people who thought themselves above others simply because of a ticket and skin color. She looked at Emma, her gaze softening. "I won't be switching seats," she said slowly, clearly. "And I suggest you call the captain. I want this incident documented." Emma froze for a moment, hesitating. Her eyes sought Thomas, as if awaiting instructions, then returned to Isabelle, realizing this woman harbored not anger, but something solid, unshakable. There was no way out. Thomas Bennett, a man used to a world where a single frown from him made others bow, suddenly realized, tonight, at 10,000 meters, he'd stumbled into a wall that power couldn't topple. The cockpit door opened, and a man in a captain's uniform stepped out, his face calm, but his eyes flickering with unease as he sensed the heavy atmosphere hanging over the business class cabin. Emma quickly approached him, whispering an explanation. Passengers looked up, all eyes converging on one point where Isabelle Carter sat, her back straight as steel amid a storm of prejudice. The captain spoke, polite but measured. "Mrs. Carter, I've been informed there's an issue regarding your seat." Isabelle didn't stand immediately. She raised her head, slowly closing the small book in her hands as if finishing a chapter. Then she looked directly at the captain, her eyes sweeping the cabin, lingering longest on Thomas Bennett. "There's no issue here, Captain," she said, her voice clear, each word carving into the air like a knife. "Only a man who believes his power and prejudice are enough to decide who deserves to be here and who doesn't." A murmur rippled through the cabin like an undercurrent. Some exchanged glances, others pretended to check their phones, but no one dared hold her gaze for more than a second. Thomas clenched his jaw, forcing a mocking smile. "You're blowing this out of proportion. It's just a small misunderstanding." Isabelle raised an eyebrow, her gaze chillingly cold. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated slowly. "When you said, 'People like you don't deserve to be here,' that's a misunderstanding? When you dragged up my past, denying my efforts, my worth, that's a misunderstanding too?" She turned, facing the entire cabin for the first time, her voice ringing out. Not loud, not harsh, but heavy as forged steel. "You might think this is trivial, a spat between two passengers, but it's not. Because every time we stay silent before words like that, we silently agree that a person's dignity can be measured by their skin, their status, or their seat number. The cabin air stretched taut as a bowstring. No one moved. Even Thomas Bennett, a man who'd never let anyone lecture him, faltered, his hand trembling slightly on the armrest. Isabelle took a deep breath, her voice settling but sharper than ever. Today I'm not standing up to defend a seat. I'm standing up because I was once a little girl in Brooklyn, taught to bow my head, to avoid trouble. I've stayed silent too many times. But this time I choose to stand firm. Not for me, but for the children out there, for the people who every day are forced to sit in the back row of their own lives. She turned to the captain. I request that the airline document this passenger's offensive behavior. And I want to hear from his own mouth, right here, right now, an apology not to me, but to everyone who's ever been looked down on because they don't fit the type to sit here. The passengers around her fell silent. Faint sighs, shifting glances began to turn toward Thomas, no longer in agreement but in anticipation. The captain nodded slowly. Emma stood behind, her eyes glistening, as if she'd just grasped something beyond the limits of a flight attendant's role. Thomas Bennett, the powerful man, suddenly seemed small amidst the luxurious expanse of the business-class cabin. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it was to be forced to face himself. Thomas Bennett stood still, as if his feet were nailed to the cabin carpet. The business-class cabin seemed to hold its breath, no more rustling of pages, no tapping of keyboards, no clinking of drinks from the attendants, just a thick, heavy air, as if the flight itself were slowing down. He looked at Isabelle. The arrogance in his eyes was gone. The cold smirk he'd worn for half his life to mask his fear of weakness had vanished. You want me to apologize? Thomas's voice came out small, almost lost. Isabelle didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was calm, profound, like still water before a storm. She tilted her head slightly, a small gesture that made Thomas feel seen through, not with anger, but with a cold truth he couldn't deny. The captain, having just emerged from the cockpit, stood there with a calm face but eyes tinged with unease. He nodded at Thomas, a reminder that this situation had slipped beyond a passenger's control. No matter how powerful he was. Thomas took a deep breath, his hand gripping the armrest until his knuckles turned white. He turned to the passengers, his voice trembling but striving to stay firm. I was wrong. I acted like someone who doesn't understand human worth. I insulted Mrs. Carter, and I'm sorry. The cabin fell silent. No one clapped, no one spoke. But this silence was no longer complicity, it was witnessing. A few passengers bowed their heads, as if ashamed on Thomas's behalf. An older man in the back row nodded slightly, a hint of respect in his eyes as he looked at Isabelle. Isabelle gave a slight nod, not in acceptance of the apology, but as if closing a chapter. She returned to her seat, her back straight, each step a silent declaration. When she sat down, seat 4A was no longer just a business-class spot, it was a flag she'd planted in the battlefield of prejudice, a victory needing no cheers. Emma, the young flight attendant, approached as the tension seemed to subside. Her hands trembled slightly, her eyes brimming with tears. She bent down, whispering, I'm sorry, ma'am. I should have stood up for you sooner. I didn't have the courage. Isabelle looked at her, her gaze softening, yet still sharp as a sheathed blade. It's all right, she replied, her voice low and warm. What matters is you've recognized what's right. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. Emma offered a faint smile, as if freed from an invisible burden. She stepped back, leaving Isabelle alone in the quiet space she'd reclaimed. Outside the window, the night sky remained pitch black, with only the weak blinking lights from the plane's wing cutting through the endless dark. The engines roared steadily, but in the business-class cabin, the air stayed heavy, as if everyone was still waiting for something, a true ending, a period to the story that had just unfolded. And then, the cockpit door swung open again. The captain stepped out, no longer with his earlier calm. He held a small microphone, his eyes scanning each passenger before settling on Isabelle. He cleared his throat, then spoke, clear and resolute. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain James Hargrove. I don't often address passengers beyond necessary announcements, but tonight I must make an exception. The cabin went utterly still. Even Thomas Bennett, who'd just slumped into his seat with a dazed expression, looked up, his eyes flickering with unease. I've just witnessed something that, in 25 years of flying, I've never seen, the captain continued, his voice low but resonant. A woman, a passenger, stood up not just to defend her seat, but to defend something we all here, myself, you, and even me, sometimes forget. Dignity has no skin color, no seat number, no ticket price. It's the one thing that keeps us human, whether we're at 10,000 meters or on the ground. He paused, his eyes resting on Isabelle. She sat there, silent, showing nothing but absolute composure. The captain went on, Mrs. Isabelle Carter, I thank you. Not for me, but for my daughter, a 12-year-old girl, I hope will one day grow up in a world where she doesn't have to prove her worth because of her skin or her roots. A soft sigh echoed from somewhere in the cabin. A woman in the back row quickly wiped her eyes. Thomas Bennett lowered his head, his hand covering a face now pale as paper. The captain set the microphone down, nodded to Isabelle once more, then returned to the cockpit. The doors closing sounded like a punctuation mark, but the story wasn't truly over. As the cabin lights flickered, signaling the plane's descent, Isabelle turned to look through the frosted window. Suddenly, a small sound came from her coat pocket, the chime of her phone, a rarity at this altitude thanks to the plane's Wi-Fi. She frowned, pulling it out. A message appeared on the screen, from an unknown number. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I heard everything. I'm in seat 12C. She looked up, her gaze sweeping to the back of the business class cabin. In seat 12C, a young black woman, about 20 years old, was watching her. The girl's eyes sparkled not with tears, but with a light of hope. She gave Isabelle a slight nod, then bent down, typing something on the laptop in front of her. Isabelle smiled, the first time during the entire flight. It wasn't a radiant or showy smile, but gentle and discreet, like a breeze over a lake. She put the phone away, closed her eyes, letting the engine's roar fill her mind. But the story didn't end there. When Flight 427 landed at JFK International Airport, passengers disembarked in silence. Thomas Bennett walked quickly, avoiding all eyes, as if trying to escape the gazes of those who'd seen his defeat. Emma, her face regaining some calm, gave Isabelle a slight bow as she passed the exit. Have a good day, ma'am, Emma said, her voice sincere. You too? Isabelle replied, then left, her figure fading into the crowd. But what no one in the business class cabin knew, not Thomas, not Emma, not even the captain, was the girl in seat 12C, the one who'd messaged Isabelle. As the plane touched down, she stood, closed her laptop, and on the screen, the final line read, Article complete. Title, At 10,000 meters, one woman changed an entire flight. That girl was Maya Jones, a freelance journalist who'd happened to be on Flight 427. Her article, published in a major newspaper the next morning, didn't just recount Isabelle Carter's story, it spread like wildfire, igniting debates everywhere about dignity, prejudice, and the right to respect. Isabelle Carter's name became a symbol not because she sought it, but because she dared to stand when no one else did. And Thomas Bennett? The next day, as he opened the paper in his luxurious Manhattan office, his face blanched when he saw a photo of himself snapped secretly by a passenger on the flight next to the article's headline. He slammed the paper shut, but he couldn't shut out the truth. At 10,000 meters, he'd lost not to Isabelle, but to the prejudice he'd built his whole life upon. Outside, New York's sky blazed with dawn light. Isabelle Carter stepped out of the airport, unaware of the article, unaware of the ripples she'd unwittingly set in motion. She paused, breathing deeply the cold morning air, then walked on. For her, it had ended on that flight, but for the world, her story had only just begun. In her hand, the crumpled plane ticket remained tightly gripped, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. Dignity isn't something others give you, it's something you hold on to yourself at any altitude.